Thank you. We're going to start with a little bit of humor that I cannot top. I don't know, how many of you have seen The Life of Brian by... Okay, well, there are some who have not. All right. Well, for those who don't know, this is a scene of these Jewish rebels in Judea who are planning to revolt against the Romans and engage in some shenanigans, and this argument results. And that was the inspiration for today's talk. What I was going to talk about, well, what I will talk about, democracy, human rights, and science mostly. But that thing reminded me of a lot of other aspects of what the Romans did for us. And it's not just the Romans, of course. The Romans spread a lot of other cultures' great inventions, both the Celts and the Greeks, the Germans. They all came up with cool stuff, and the Romans spread it around and improved on it. And we're going to see some examples. Of course, those of you who want to know, if you don't know already, the Roman Empire is basically the Mediterranean, Europe, including much of Britain, the Middle East, and North Africa. And that was the area encompassed by the Roman Empire at the time that that scene was set, and the time, of course, of Jesus and the origins of Christianity. Now, the first one they have in there, like they brought us wine, that actually isn't true. The Romans didn't bring them wine. What the Romans did bring was cheap wine, as in more efficiently produced and transported wine. They improved the wine industry in terms of transport and so on. Actually, wine came from the Phoenicians, who got it from the Greeks, who got it from some tribes in the Balkans, and it filtered its way down. But the Romans really revolutionized the industry in many ways. We're not going to go into that because wine is not that important for the history of such things as human rights and whatnot. But when we get to like science and political reality that we want to emulate, of course we don't want to emulate everything the Romans did. Imperialism, bad, for example. Slavery, bad, and so on. But they got some things right, and then we've picked up on. They brought us roads. You heard them mention that in there. Roman roads were so well built that there's some of them that are still standing today, 2,000 years later. If you're used to seeing how often your local road gets destroyed in a matter of years, you might appreciate the significance of that. Now, this is a map just of Roman roads in Palestine in the time of the origins of Christianity. So the Roman road networks were pretty extensive, even in minor provinces like that. Someone put together an excellent subway map of the Roman road system. You can find this online. I think this is brilliant. It's all in Latin. It's a excellent parody, but accurate actually. So and that's just the major roads, of course, right? Not the offshoot roads, the smaller roads. The Roman road system was built the same way as the United States interstate highway system. Its original intent, of course, was for military purposes. Eisenhower wanted to be able to have entire troops moved from one side of the country to the other. They realized in World War II they didn't have a system that would do that. So they built this interstate highway system so that you could do more effective troop movements and supply movements during a major war in the future. But of course, once you've built and maintained this system, what it actually ends up becoming is a fantastic system for commerce and communication and travel. So the same thing happened in ancient Rome. They built the roads for war purposes, but then everyone started using them, and Rome expected people to use them for commerce, trade, travel, communication, because you had all-weather, low-friction systems of cargo transport over land, and they were maintaining it that way. Now, this road system is expensive to maintain. If you want to have an excellent road system, you have to pay for it. And of course, Roman taxes, that's one of the things that they use that tax money for. But you have to have a really brilliant administration to keep this whole system going. You have to have a good economy to have that system going, and engineers. But one of the interesting things the Romans did with that, by the way, is in a sense, the taxing for the building of the roads also funded the military, because it was the military that built these roads and maintained them. So when the military wasn't fighting, when the soldiers weren't at war, they'd be tasked with building and maintaining roads. That was one of their functions. So in a sense, they got 2 for 1. You got an entire road system and a massive military for the same tax. They brought us aqueducts. That was another one of the things mentioned in there. And that's a Greek technology, but the Romans vastly improved on it. Allowed urbanization and economic booms. And people don't think about this, but if you want to have a city like Rome was of 1 million people, or Alexandria, 700,000 people, even Jerusalem was in the 100,000 range. If you want to have a city of that size, you've got to have water for them to drink. And normally your average street well is not going to handle that. So if you want to actually have a major civilization, if you want to have cities, you need massive water transport. And that's what this aqueduct technology allowed to happen. And then of course it also allows economic boom as a result, because you can have massive cities, and now you can have massive economic activity. So it all matters in that sense. And this is another thing that taxes have to pay for if you want to actually have this happen. It also allowed agricultural boom. They were able to agriculturally cultivate lands that were otherwise barren because they could transport water to irrigate them. And when they built these things, they used advanced concretes and mortars that, in fact, we'd forgotten the technology in the Middle Ages. Only just recently have they started figuring out how Roman concretes and mortars were actually constructed. And that's one of the secrets to their massive survivability. Superb engineering. This is the Pont du Gard. This is 2,000 years old. Yeah. So not only do the roads last forever, some of their aqueducts do pretty well as well. And here's another shot of that. That's in France. Massive. It's both a road and an aqueduct, so you get a 2-for-1 on that one. The Romans also did other things. One of the things that Christian apologists today try to insist the pagans would never do is they didn't believe in defying nature. They thought going against nature was bad. Well, hell with that. The Romans loved going against nature as one of their favorite things to do. And one of the things they did was make water roll uphill. This is what's called an inverted siphon. You have water from one end, goes down piping system, and just from the water pressure created, it allows you to pipe it up without any additional energy to a height. So you can actually make water run uphill using this technology. And the Romans exploited this a lot. And we have the ruins of many of these aqueduct siphons around the world. This is one of them. So you'd have a concrete or clay pipe running up this ramp, transport water uphill. They brought us sanitation and public health, and certainly massive improvements on it. This is another 2,000-year-old Roman construction. This is the sewers of Rome. And you can see it's still in pretty good shape considering. So they developed advanced sewer systems, actually greatly improved the sewage removal from cities, developed much more advanced public toilets and baths, public baths as a concept in and of itself. Greek idea, but the Romans popularized it massively and improved on it. They developed the toilet sponge. So instead of using your hand, they had a sponge on a stick, which is the early version of toilet paper. They introduced soap. Now the soap actually came from the Germans in the early Roman Empire, but the Romans loved the idea and spread it everywhere. So soap first entered the world then. They also had developed in the medical field, they had antiseptics. They understood the concept that you had to clean instruments, clean your hands, clean your wounds, and things like that. They didn't know that germs were everywhere. They hadn't really figured that out yet. So they didn't know how fastidious they needed to be, but they were aware that there was some need of antiseptic technologies. Now, contradictorily, honey is actually a major antiseptic because it's anoxic. Even though it's full of sugars, it has no air to breathe. So honey, you can actually put honey on a wound, and that actually is antiseptic. But better antiseptics include turpentine, pitch, and they had various other types. They had the equivalent of canneries. Of course, they weren't using cans. They used clay pots and glass jars. And you'd have potted food that could be stored. Lots of stuff would be packed in honey. This is another way that you would keep food around forever. Or vinegar and other substances. So they developed that as well. So you'd actually had food storage improvements. And climate-based architectural design, taking into account prevailing winds, solar light, and so on, to keep cities as healthy as possible. All of these things they brought wherever they went. They brought education. Now, I wrote a book called Science Education in the early Roman Empire, and this covers the entire education system in the ancient world under the Romans with the focus on the science content, but it covers the whole thing. So if you want to really understand how education worked in the ancient world, that's the book for you. And we take for granted a lot of the things that they developed and spread around that didn't really exist before. Again, this is spreading around Greek ideas, but the Romans perfected them and spread them. They added, first of all, math, science, and logic to the education system, so it's started to become standard in various levels of the education system. They expanded literacy and numeracy in the sense that they made it more accessible and more available. They still only achieved about maybe 20%, 10 to 20% of the empire was literate, but that's a huge improvement on what may have been the case before, which might have been closer to 1%. And at higher levels of education, logic, reason, and what I call persuasion technologies. You hear the word rhetoric, but for them, rhetoric was a way to persuade someone of something. But rhetoric is both a defense against the dark arts and a dark art in and of itself. So if you know rhetoric, you know how to outthink rhetoric. You know when rhetoric is being used on you. So it actually does contribute to critical thinking. So logic, reason, and persuasion technologies were fundamental to the higher levels of Roman education. They also developed the first universities in the sense that they had endowed professorships. The empire would set up fixed professorships, so there'd be an endowment to cover their salary, and they'd be appointed in different departments, humanities, and the equivalent of sciences, which would be philosophy, actually. So they'd have literature professors and philosophy professors organized in specific cities around the same area with a public library and areas to teach and so on. So it's basically the equivalent of what we would call a university. And there were major ones of these in Rome, Athens, and Alexandria. They were being developed by Vespasian, Hadrian, and Aurelius, the three emperors that contributed the most to these basically fledgling universities. And they included state libraries and professorships, but public libraries were everywhere, actually, in the Roman Empire. It was a major contribution. Not mentioned in there is like libraries. They brought us libraries, public libraries, that anyone could walk into and read any book if you were literate, which was the challenge, but they were available to the public. They brought us peace and public order. Of course, they did that in extremely unethical ways as well, but some of the things that were underlying that were good ideas and worth picking up and running with. So democracy, not in the Bible. You look in there, the whole concept of democracy is not in there anywhere. Democracy was developed by the Greeks and picked up by the Romans, and then by the time Christianity arose, we have the corruption of the political system. So we have sham democracy. So it's pretending to be a democracy, but it's still under the thumb of imperial forces and corruption. Of course, so are a lot of other democracies today. So that's not too unusual. And other things were going wrong at the time. Of course, imperialism and slavery were still a thing. Women had minimal rights and so on. But the Romans still brought the Greek ideals of democracy, the ideals of them, even if they didn't realize them. People still spoke their praises and spoke of them, and sometimes realized them. Of democracy, citizenship, civic duty, public administration, and civil and human rights. I'm going to give you some examples of that later. But we take for granted some of these things as just normal now, but they weren't normal back then. So when the Romans were coming in and changing how people ran their governments and how societies were run, they brought certain things that are great ideas, if you think about them. Law courts, advanced bureaucracy and administration, based on rational standards of evidence. In other words, you couldn't go in there and accuse someone of magic. So even in both courts, in the enaction of laws and in the enaction of legislation, wizardry, witches, all of that stuff doesn't show up. Everything is evidence-based in how they decide things. Unlike you find there's a trial in the Bible, a trial method in the Bible where if you want to find out if a woman is an adulteress, you give her this weird garbage potion of like blood-filled ashes or something, and if she like vomits, then she's, I can't remember if that means she is or isn't an adulterer, but anyway, clearly not an evidence-based method of determining the truth in court. But what the Romans and the Greeks brought is this concept that you actually have to argue a case from evidence only, and you just can't just make claims about gods and spirits and stuff. They also invented they didn't invent, but spread the concept of citizenship. This is another Greek idea that the Romans picked up and spread. Now we take that for granted as a thing, but that wasn't really a thing. If you look in the Bible, citizenship doesn't show up in there as a thing. You're either a Jew or you're not. You could join the Jews, you could cut off a piece of your penis and follow the dietary laws and become an honorary Jew, and then your children would just be treated like Jews. But that meant you were joining a racial group, you were joining an ethnic group, you were joining a religion. That was the only thing you could do. The concept of citizenship is entirely secular. It's just you are a citizen of the city, and that comes with certain specific rights and duties. The very concept of civic duty, that you have a duty to your city and to your state in terms of the things you give back, but also things the state gives to you in terms of rights, calling it rights, and developing them as a contract that you have with your community. That's a Greek idea, and the Romans were spreading it and still using it. Public welfare, they had medical and educational endowments. So there were publicly funded doctors in some cities and towns, publicly funded education, privately funded endowments for these things as well. Philanthropy in general, philanthropy is a Greek word. The Greeks invented the concept of philanthropy and named it, because when you invent a thing you get to name it. Charity, public and private, was a thing that the Romans were spreading. Now, this existed on a smaller scale in all cultures, but they brought an institutionalized concept of this. The idea of, for example, an endowment that you establish, and it gives out money, it loans out money, and the interest on the loans actually funds the activity of the endowment year by year, so it actually is a perpetual endowment that provides charitable activity. Freedom of speech was defended even when suppressed. Now, freedom of speech did generally exist as long as you didn't talk about the emperor, then they would come down on you. So they didn't have complete free speech. But even when the emperors would come down on you for undesirable political speech, there were a lot of people who were complaining about that and grumbling and saying that's actually contrary to our values. So the idea that this was valuable, that you should be able to have freedom of speech and it should not be subject to the oppression from above, that was an idea that was still being spread by the Romans at the time. They would have found ridiculous the concept of murdering someone, executing someone for blasphemy, for example. Unthinkable. And that also led to religious freedom. You actually had religious freedom under the Roman Empire. What you didn't have, now people often refer to, well, but what about the Romans? They persecuted the Christians. Actually, they didn't persecute the Christians for anything they believed. They didn't care what the Christians believed. They didn't care what gods the Christians prayed to. What they were concerned about was that something that we take for granted now, that's in our First Amendment, called the right of assembly. The right to peaceable assembly. Actually, I don't think ever existed in the history of the human race until the United States Constitution put it in. This concept that just general people, have the right to assemble and discuss things and do whatever they want without the government coming in and breaking them up and saying, no, you can't do that. Well, that right didn't exist in ancient Rome. You had to get a license from the state to have assemblies of any kind. So even if you wanted to have firemen, if you wanted to have a fire station with firemen that hang out and are ready to go put out fires, you had to get a license from the state to say, okay, we'll let you do that. And some places were such political hotbeds, the state would say, nope, we're not allowing you to have firemen because they get political and we don't like that. So there was no right of assembly, and so that's why the Romans actually came down on the Christians. Was the Christians were engaging in assemblies without a state license, and so they were being oppressed for a political activity, even though that's not what they were really engaging in. So here's an example of something. This is before Jesus, right? This is 100 years before Christianity began. Cicero on the Republic, and that's a quote of his. There is in fact a true law from right reason which is in accordance with nature, applies to all people, and is unchangeable and eternal. By its commands, this law summons men to the performance of their duties. By its prohibitions, it restrains them from doing wrong. To invalidate this law by human legislation is never morally right, nor is it permissible ever to restrict its operation. And to annul it wholly is impossible, for there will be one law, eternal and unchangeable, binding at all times and upon all people. And there will be, as it were, one common master and ruler of men. That is God, who is the author of this law, its interpreter and its sponsor. Now that sounds very religious-y, and it is a little bit religious-y, but Cicero isn't talking about God or religion in the way Christians imagine it. Cicero means through God's governance of the natural universe. In other words, he's talking more like a deist. And not through any church employing men acting as God's representatives. That would have been ridiculous to him. Nor through any promises of heaven or hell, by the way. This isn't how it was enforced. It was just based on evidence and reason. It was just supposed to be obvious that there were this way the world should work. Now there's a place we've seen this before. You might recognize some of those ideas in there. They come from around 300 BC. The Stoic philosopher Zeno, who originated Stoicism, originated the idea that, quote, we should regard all people as our fellow citizens and neighbors, and there should be one way of life and order like that of a herd grazing together and nurtured by a common law. And this is based on the pagan idea, as he argues, adduced from the evidence of reason and the natural world, not from scripture, not from revelation or anything like that we are all created by God and therefore share equally in his nature. Does that sound familiar? Remember that quote a while back from the Declaration of Independence? Well, it comes from this idea that we were all created equal. That's a pagan statement. That doesn't come from the Bible. There's no statement in the Bible that all men were created equal. That comes from pagan theology, and you see a little bit of it here and from Cicero just before. Even John Locke's idea of rights and government as a social contract derives from another pagan, Epicurus. The Epicureans developed the idea of social contract theory, which became fundamental to modern government and politics and political thinking. And Locke didn't find that anywhere in the Bible either. There's no social contract theory in the Bible. That would have been absurd. Certainly not in the words of Moses, Jesus, or Paul. No, this idea of a social contract, that governments and rights are that, comes from pagans. This is a pagan idea. Likewise, the idea that all men are created equal, that was that Stoic philosophy of human rights, and that protecting personal liberty and private property is the principal aim of government, as opposed to enforcing obligations, especially to deities. If you look at the laws, the 670 whatever laws that are in the Old Testament, it's all about enforcing obligations upon the membership of the community. It's not about protecting anyone's rights per se. It's not framed that way. But the idea that the purpose of government is protecting the rights of individuals, and therefore when a government stops doing that effectively, it makes sense to rebel against it, that actually comes from pagan thought. Cicero talks about it, and several others did at the time. So what do we got here? We've got all of these ideas that, what did the Romans ever do for us? They spread these ideas. And the ones they didn't develop themselves, they got from the Greeks, and gave us this legacy that we now depend on. The idea of building a government on evidence and reason rather than divine revelation. No religion or scriptures involved here. You have to persuade. You can't just say God said so. That's no longer a valid way of arguing in law or legislation. The idea of citizenship rather than race or religion defining group membership and responsibilities. The idea of democracy, that people should get to vote on their fate. In the Greek origin of this idea was really everybody votes, which is kind of mob rule. The Romans kind of tamed that a bit by developing representative democracy. Legislation should be voted on by a body of elected leaders. In other words, the general body of people would elect leaders, and those leaders would create legislation. Sound familiar? That's our government right there. Our government is very much based on the model of the Roman Republic before the empire fucked everything up. But that concept comes from the Romans, the idea of representative democracy. The idea of a constitution, that you write up this constitution that establishes civil rights and the division of powers, rather than assigning all powers to one sovereign who's in charge of everything, the king or the emperor or whatever, you would divide powers amongst different groups, and so that you would have a balance of power among them, including the idea of the veto, the ability to veto an action of another legislator or another actor in the system. All of that comes from the pagans. Again, you won't find that in the Bible. These ideas aren't in there. And the idea of human rights, rights that ought to be even when leaders and laws don't recognize them, just as Cicero was arguing there. Again, that's a pagan theological concept, pagan philosophical concept. It doesn't appear in the Bible. You won't find the word rights or the concept of rights, human or civil, in there at all. And then, of course, that's all the political stuff, human rights, democracy, and all that. So what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, they gave us that stuff. Then there's all the intellectual stuff that's pretty cool. They brought us medicine, by which I mean scientific medicine, right? Evidence-based medicine, not the woo stuff that superstitious people were using at the time. They developed empirical scientific basis for anatomy, human, animal, and plant, physiology and biomechanics, pharmacology, hygiene, nutrition, and exercise was a big thing that they studied and wanted to perfect. Advanced surgical techniques and instruments. They were performing successful open heart surgeries, for example, if you can imagine that. Another example is perineal lithotomy, where you actually punch a hole in the bladder, send in some instruments in there, grab a kidney stone and pull it out. They even had the technology to go in there, crush the kidney stone or cut it and pull it out in pieces. They were very effective at that. And a lot of other things that they did. I mentioned pharmacology up there. We have several textbooks of theirs listing drug collections. One of them has been studied scientifically, and that's the famous herbal of Dioscorides. All of the drugs in that have been tested, and it's been found that 20% of them actually function as described. So the other 80% are placebos, obviously. But they didn't really have effective means of distinguishing placebo technology from actual effective medicine. So that's not surprising, but 20% is actually pretty good because it's a huge book with lots of drugs in it. And then there's another example I give, Agathenus. I talk about these examples and many more in my book on ancient science, ancient scientists. Agathenus is famous for, they wanted to come up with some sort of anesthetic to be able to knock people out during surgery. Of course, the biggest problem with anesthesia is it either doesn't knock them out all the way and therefore is not working, or it knocks them out too well and kills them. So you got to get your dosage right. So Agathenus basically tested with dogs of different weight and used hellebore as his base, and so he would dose the dogs in different amounts and see. He basically came up with a formula for the amount of weight that the dog had versus how much hellebore would kill the dog versus how much wouldn't knock it out, and actually developed a dosage by scale system. So that gives you an idea of how experimentation was being used to perfect the medical art, and animal experimentation, which we still do today. Yeah, so that they're doing all kinds of amazing stuff like that. And here's an example of an instrument to give you an idea. This is a Roman cataract syringe. You can see it's a needle that fits inside another needle. So you literally, and you can see they're pulling it out of there. You use the needle, and the needle that it fits inside has a hole on the end, and so you put the needle through there. You can poke into the eye, pull out the needle, and now you've got still got a needle in there, but it's got a hole at the tip, and you can actually suck out the cataract, for example. They were doing these kinds of things. And the craftsmanship involved in this is fantastic. But this is the kind of scientific medicine they brought. Here's a vaginal speculum for those who actually want to be terrified. Here's another shot of those. We have a lot of these instruments recovered from Pompeii. A whole doctor's office was buried in ash there, and we got all that person's instruments. Now, I want to be equal opportunity here and not just freak out the women with this technology, and show you something here. This is a bronze male catheter, if you want to picture that, gentlemen. Yeah, not plastic, not glass, bronze, and you know, that will go up your hoo-ha when necessary. That was considered a major scientific achievement, the ability to use this technology to basically save lives through scientific enterprise in medicine. Now, that was just medicine. They brought us science in general. There's actually a lot of science they were doing. Now, for you to understand the timeline, there's the pre-Socratic age is when we first started getting away from primitive supernatural ways of explaining things. Like everything's a god, everything's a spirit, everything's magic. When we first started saying, oh no, it's natural causes, well, you have the pre-Socratics doing that, and most of what they're doing is making it up. But there's at least making up natural causes and not systems of natural causes rather than resorting to gods and supernaturalism. Now that led to people arguing over, well, how do you know your claim is true? Well, how do you know your claim is true? And so they started bickering over how you prove your point, and that led to actual empirical science as people started to realize, well, if I have evidence, that kind of trumps any other argument you make. And that led to the Aristotelian age, where we get the first true empirical science as a formal system developed. And then that just started things. Aristotle just began all this stuff. Then there's the Alexandrian age, the Hellenistic period after that, where scientists just took this idea and ran with it and made huge improvements in lots of ways, refuted a lot of the conclusions of Aristotle by getting closer to the scientific truth with further empirical science. And then the Romans came along and loved this stuff, picked it up, and kept running with it. And that brings us to the Roman age, which extends this Hellenistic science into the Roman era, continued making advances, and so on. And I cover the whole history of this in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. Now, they did a lot of things. Now, their science still relied on a lot of wishy-washy methods that we wouldn't approve of today. But they did add some things to the toolbox of scientific methodology that we still use today. And in fact, part of the scientific revolution was realizing that those tools were key, the ones that we should stick with, and we should throw out all the other tools. And